Hello, Archie Dunlop here with Talking Astrology with Archie on Friday, February the 13th, 2026. Today, Saturn moves into Aries, at least late today. If you're in the Americas, Saturn moves into Aries. If you're not in the Americas, Saturn will move into Aries tomorrow. And in this video, I will be looking at Saturn and Aries and what it might mean for all of us and for the world in general. As far as my video for yesterday, Thursday, is concerned, there was a problem. I wanted to talk about the 12 signs as usual, but I made a video, but I forgot to record it. So basically, I forgot to record the sound. So I had a silent video, so I had to make a shortened video, and that was a real tragedy. But in that shortened video, I did talk about the shooting in Canada in Tumbler Ridge, and I've gone and written that shooting up on my Substack. So I've just created a Substack, and there is a link to the Substack in the description. So if you want to follow that link and subscribe, go ahead. It doesn't cost you anything. Anyway, let's start off by looking at the astrology and the I Ching for today. So here is the chart for February the 13th, set for noon New York time. So you can see that the moon is still in Capricorn. It's at, where has it gone? It's at 10 degrees Capricorn. So we do have a planet in an Earth sign. Well, we've got Uranus in Taurus. Got the moon in Capricorn. And the moon in Capricorn is making a sextile to Mercury. It's also making a sextile to Venus. So at the beginning of the day, you've got moon in Capricorn making a sextile to Venus in Pisces, and it moves on to the sextile to Mercury to Mercury in Pisces. So I would have said that those two sextiles are pretty good. They allow us to communicate freely, perhaps, though it's not necessarily very spectacular. It's moon in Capricorn. Moon in Capricorn. It's quite a down to earth placement. We think about what is important, and we like to focus on the things that matter to us. And so there may not be a huge amount of drama here, and we shouldn't forget that the moon has it's left Sagittarius, so there aren't any planets in fire signs unless you count Neptune in Aries. So that might indicate, a degree of stability. But is today going to be interesting? Well, not necessarily. I mean, we'd like it to be interesting, but it may be hard work creating sufficient interest to make us feel that we're really at the center of things, to make us feel that things are really buzzing. Is today going to be buzzing? I don't think so, at least not in most cases. Now, a few other aspects. We've got Mars making a quincunx to Jupiter. So there is Mars in Aquarius, 150 degrees from Jupiter in Cancer. This quincunx between Mars and Jupiter may indicate our frustration, because there's not sufficient excitement. Mars is looking for action, but Mars in Aquarius, but Jupiter is perhaps sort of more sensible, more serious. Jupiter is in Cancer, so we have to think, with this Aquarius Cancer quincunx, it might be that if we try too hard to make things happen, or perhaps to be controversial in terms of what we say, we might tread on people's toes, and we might discover that certain people are more traditional and more moralistic than we expect. But somehow we have to incorporate this Jupiter in Cancer. So Mars in Aquarius, by all means, try to be independent. Try to do things differently, but you also have to understand the fundamental limitations around you, and those limitations are about what people can deal with, because there's only so much people can cope with, and they do have their boundaries. Additionally, we have a semi-sextile between Venus and Pluto. So Venus and Pluto are exactly 30 degrees apart. So Venus in Pisces, semi-sextile Pluto in Aquarius. So that Pluto in Aquarius is quite a free-thinking energy. It is the new. Perhaps it relates to technology. Perhaps it relates to just the challenges of the modern world. And then Venus in Pisces kind of conflicts with it. It's a semi-sextile. It's not a square, but Venus in Pisces would just like to be able to go with the flow, just go with it, and perhaps work on a mainly emotional level. But then Pluto is saying, no, it's more complicated than that, and it's more dramatic than that, and there's something else you need to consider. There are big changes afoot, and so we must be careful how far we drift in terms of our emotions, and perhaps also in terms of relationships. And there just might be something else we have to consider, represented by Pluto in Aquarius. Now, the headline event today is Saturn moving into Aries. So at noon, we have Saturn is at 29:55 Pisces, so that's noon New York time. And a Saturn goes into Aries on Saturday, London time, at 11 minutes past midnight. So, if you are in Europe, Australia, New Zealand, then it's a case that Saturn doesn't go into Aries until tomorrow. But if you're in the Americas, then this evening, perhaps even late afternoon, if you're in California, the Saturn does change sign. Now, I'm not saying that you're immediately going to feel that, but it is something important. Saturn is on the Aries point. Even just before Saturn changes sign, when Saturn is at 5 minutes to five arc minutes, 29:55 Pisces, just 5 arc minutes before the Aries point. Even then, we do get the Aries point feel, the fact that Saturn is on the Aries point. And this might just create a certain heaviness, a heaviness relating to the world in general, because Saturn is here. It's not even about Saturn being in Aries. It's just about this heavy force making itself felt, and we can't entirely avoid it. And this is going to be at maximum impact, maximum intensity when Saturn is right close to the Aries point. So next week, as Saturn plows on through the first few arc minutes and then the first few degrees of Aries, it will move further away from the Aries point, so we won't have to be so concerned about it. It's important also because we've got a Saturn-Neptune conjunction coming up. In fact, the Aries point at the moment is on the Saturn-Neptune midpoint. Saturn is on one side of the Aries point, Neptune is on the other side, and so Saturn and Neptune does represent just a lot of the confusion that we feel. What can we trust? Maybe this is one reason why people are so obsessed about gold. I'm not making any forecasts about the gold price, but people feel that everything is falling apart, and you've got to own something that you trust. And it might be that once Saturn gathers strength through Aries. Well, gathers strength, is that the right word? Not necessarily. But once Saturn starts plowing through Aries, people will start to look at security in a different way. And that is something that I will be talking about at the end of a video. So that's the broad astrological picture set for New York. if we set the chart for Sydney, Australia, well, Saturn is definitely not going to move into Aries today if you're in Australasia. And at the beginning of the day, at noon in Sydney, Australia, remember this is a representative of East Asia, Australia, New Zealand. The moon is at 2 degrees Capricorn. So that means that, the main aspect here, at least the main lunar aspect, if you're in Australia and New Zealand, is the moon sextile Venus. Moon in Capricorn, sextile Venus in Pisces. That is a very pleasant aspect. It allows us to, well, I don't say us because I'm not in Australasia, but it allows you to, be quite relaxed and have good contacts, with other people. And it's an aspect that is quite calming. It's not an exciting aspect, moon sextile Venus. And perhaps we don't want excitement, or perhaps you don't want excitement. So you can sort of gently enjoy life and perhaps gently enjoy other people, relationships, your social life. Other people, are there. Do take advantage of them. It doesn't mean to say that you have to be entirely alone. If there are people around, do make the effort, but you don't have to make the effort in a particularly spectacular way. Also, with Moon making a sextile to Venus, it can be quite disciplined. So if you are in Australasia, your approach to life and your approach to other people will be quietly disciplined, and maybe you can come over as being a sensible, organised person, the kind of person that can be trusted. And then we have the heliocentric view, putting the Sun at the center of the solar system. So the Earth is at 25 Leo, and it's making a sextile to Chiron at 26 degrees Aries. So with this sextile between Earth and Chiron, that means that it is a time perhaps to be doing things differently, for expressing our individuality, and also perhaps for expressing our discontent with the way things are going. But we do have to be careful, because one other aspect we've got heliocentrically is a square between Mercury and Mars. You can see Mercury is at 12 degrees Taurus, Mars is at 11 degrees Aquarius. So if you've got a Mercury-Mars aspect, that can be quite verbal, but the question is, what are we talking about? And it might be quite easy to express our irritation. And if things aren't right, we're going to want to tell people that this is the case, at least from a heliocentric viewpoint. Now, because it's a heliocentric chart, that doesn't mean to say that we're necessarily going to be wrapped up in it, because it's very impersonal. But there's just something in the cosmos that is irritated. And once we pick up on this irritation, if we pick up on it, then it may be difficult to forget what we feel, to forget what we've noticed, and we might just feel that just something needs to be said. Okay, so that's the picture astrologically for today, Friday, and now I want to turn to the 12 signs. So these are my forecasts for today, which is Friday, February the 13th, 2026. Aries. Saturn is on the absolute verge of moving into your sign. And if you're in the Americas, that means that this evening, or perhaps even late afternoon, Saturn will move into Aries. And this might be something that is bothering you. I mean, Saturn has a poor reputation, you could say. Saturn. I mean, that's a a real weight on your shoulders, and Saturn, moving into Aries. Oh, that sounds grim, but I don't think that it need be grim. I mean, Saturn is a planet which is often connected with discipline and responsibility, and with Saturn moving into Aries, it just might occur to you that you have to get yourself together. That there are things that aren't properly organized, and now is the time to do something about it. And it's just a question of time scale. As an Aries, you can be quite impatient, and you might want sort of instant results. But Saturn in Aries, it is fallen. I mean, that's what they say when Saturn is in Aries. Well, it's exalted in Libra, therefore it's fallen in Aries. And the question is, why is Saturn fallen in Aries? Well, I'll be talking about that later in the video. But the thing is, just in general, things just might be slow. And if you can accept that things are going to be slower than usual, then I do think that things should be okay. And you shouldn't forget that Saturn is going to be staying in Aries, for some time. It's not just a 1 week wonder. It will stay in Aries for a few years. So that is something perhaps you have to prepare for, and you need to be more disciplined, more organized, and more together in the way you are. And you can see that when you look at the world. Saturn is pretty close to the Aries point. Even if you're in Australia, or say Saturn certainly doesn't move into your sign until well into tomorrow, but it doesn't matter, because Saturn is close enough to the Aries point, even if it's in very late Pisces. And the Aries point, the beginning of your sign, there is that weight there, and it's not necessarily your weight. It's just the weight of the world, and it's tough. And perhaps you can just feel the tragedy of the world as well. I mean, that might be part of it. It is really heavy. What do they call it? The lacrimae mundi, isn't that the tears of the world? Yeah, but you can feel that, and it's all around. And with Saturn on the Aries, point, and it isn't personal, but life goes on, and the moon is continuing to move through Capricorn, and the moon in Capricorn makes a sextile to Venus, and then it makes a sextile to Mercury. And these are aspects that you can definitely benefit from. It depends to an extent what you are doing, but if you are an ambitious Aries, and there are things that you want to do, you want to get together, then I think that those two sextiles are going to be very helpful. You're going to be able to use your various abilities in a way that is going to be effective. And if there's something that you are trying to achieve, then I think that your natural talent is just going to really help you. But you don't have to show off about it. In fact, it might be the case that the less said, the better. I mean, I know as an Aries, you can like attention, you can like to be in the center of things, but as far as today is concerned, it just might be best if you, really, keep it all under wraps. You don't have to announce what you're doing. Even though I think you want to. You shouldn't forget that there is a quincunx aspect between Mars and Jupiter. So Mars is your ruler. It's quincunx Jupiter. So with this quincunx to Jupiter, there's something you really want to do. You really want to utilize your energy, express your energy. But if you just act immediately and you just express your energy in a clumsy way, then that is going to backfire. You have to be more clever about it. You have to think about what is the right approach. And I think it goes back to this concept of discretion and keeping things to yourself and being quite disciplined. And so, yeah, you might not feel discipline, you might not feel that you're ready for discipline, but if you can be disciplined and organized, and you can accept that some things are going to take a long time to get together, but you will get them together. I mean, it's the results that matter, not the time scale. Then I think that it can be a very constructive Friday. Taurus. The moon continues to move through Capricorn, and I think having the moon in Capricorn, is great. I mean, I know that the moon is supposedly in its detriment in Capricorn. You think that the moon is a sort of an emotional energy, and you don't want to have it in Capricorn because Capricorn is just a little bit too materialistic for the moon's liking. But moon in Capricorn does know how to look after itself, and it's not going to sort of float off on a cloud of fantasy, but at the same time it can be quite imaginative. It can be aware of possibilities, many possibilities, but it also knows that there are limits. You can't be all things to all people. You can't just follow your every whim. You have to concentrate on what matters to you, and that requires focus. But it's a focus, Capricorn, that you are very much able to provide. Now, the moon in Capricorn does make a sextile to Venus and a sextile to Mercury. I think the sextile to Venus is particularly relevant because Venus is your ruler. Now, that moon sextile Venus is more about the beginning of the day, perhaps more relevant if you're in Asia or Australia or New Zealand, but I think that it doesn't take away from the fact that the moon and Venus, they do have a sextile relationship to each other. They are in sort of signs that work very well, that can cooperate with each other. Capricorn and Pisces. So with moon sextile Venus and moon sextile Mercury and the moon sextile the North Node, that would indicate that you do have a natural ability right now to just be sociable and to be warm and friendly, even though the moon is in Capricorn. So in fact, Taurus, there might be a slight distinction here. You yourself might have a keen awareness of where your own interests lie, but at the same time you can be warm and friendly. You can be warm and friendly to the point where your own interests might be threatened, and I don't think you'll ever reach that point. I mean, you're not going to want to act in a way that is against your own best interests, but very often you can do something which helps another person but doesn't cost you anything, and perhaps that's what you should be looking for. Also, Taurus, I think that your mind is going to be on good form. I think this is already suggested by the fact that the moon is making a sextile to Mercury, but there are other things to look at. And so, Taurus, you might be having all sorts of ideas, all sorts of inspirations, and perhaps you'll have a chance to express what you think. It depends who you're dealing with, and maybe you'll just want to keep things to yourself. But if you've got an idea, work with it. Try to develop it, and it might really take the form of inspiration. You're minding your own business, and then suddenly something occurs to you, and you can't make it go away. And if you have a sudden realization, then do take it seriously. Do work with it, and in your own way, Taurus, I think today you can be quite an original thinker, and some people might pick up on that. Although overall, I don't think today, looking across everyone, the 12 signs and so forth, I don't think today is going to be especially exciting. I think that you can express a certain excitement, a certain dynamism, which some people might find to be rather appealing. Gemini. Things are maybe getting a little complicated, in some regards. You can see that things aren't, entirely simple. I mean, you might like things to be simple, but they're not, and you need to look at everything again and ask whether it really makes sense. And if something doesn't make sense, you've got to give yourself the time. It's really worth it. And it's maybe the case that you're dealing with a complicated problem, perhaps related to your career or your overall sense of direction. It's not easy, but where there's a will, there's a way. And with the moon making that sextile to Mercury, you can perhaps use your feelings. Not always easy for a Gemini, but Mercury is your ruler. It is in Pisces. It's still conjunct the North Node, and so by listening rather than talking, by feeling rather than thinking, you might be able to start to understand what is going on. And I don't think it will be easy. It may take a bit of effort, and in the process, it might be a case that you shouldn't necessarily talk too much. I mean, you might like to talk too much. You might like to talk. I don't know about too much. I think that there are lots of things you can talk about. I mean, you think Moon sextile Mercury sounds indeed very talkative. I mean, the Moon and Mercury are both the communication planets, but we're thinking about sort of quality rather than quantity. Sure, you could wax lyrical about everything under the sun, but would you actually achieve anything? I think it's probably better if you keep most of your thoughts to yourself, and that you perhaps think about how you're going to use the Mercury symbolism. I mean, Mercury is not just about talking, it's also about thinking. It's about how you communicate not just with other people, but with yourself. And because Mercury is in Pisces, your thoughts are going to be influenced by the way you feel, and you therefore need to allow this process to develop. And you can then, I think, get some very valuable insights. And I did say that today could be complicated, and if you take things head on, if you try to just look at things from a logical viewpoint, then they're going to stay complicated. On the other hand, if you can use your feelings, then I think that you can work out the underlying truth of the matter. Of course, I'm talking about something rather theoretical. I'm just trying to use the symbolism. I'm a Gemini, and I'm sure I won't be able to follow my own advice. I'm very much sort of locked into my cognitions and my thoughts, and where my feelings do operate, they're often not very helpful. But if you do get a feeling about something, Gemini, then you should probably go with it. And in general today, try to be as natural as possible. And if things just happen, if they just occur, just try to go with it. Try to do what you're good at if you can. I mean, that's the best way to get attention. If you've got a choice, something you're doing something new might be interesting, but if you can do it in a different way, which is the traditional way, the way you are used to, then I think that is the best approach. And if you can tune into what you already know, what you're already good at, then I do think that over the course of the day you can be quietly impressive. Cancer. You still have to take into account other people. I mean, other people can't be entirely ignored. I mean, after all, the moon is in Capricorn. It is in your opposite sign, and that needn't be such a bad thing. I mean, the moon, while it's in Capricorn, does make a sextile to Venus, and it also makes a sextile to Mercury. So I think that means that you can be quite sociable if you want to be sociable, and it's not necessarily just about unfocused socializing. Think about how you can benefit from other people, how you can perhaps even be inspired by them. That is possible. And there's nothing wrong with being inspired. There's nothing to be afraid of. Being shown a different view of the world can be useful. I mean, you need to be thinking about the next challenge. This is a time, Cancer, when you need to start to think about what you are trying to succeed at. But at the moment, you can do it in a slow way. You can be quite experimental. You can listen to different ideas, listen to what different people have to say. I don't think that you have to completely sort of commit yourself. I mean, although the pressure for commitment and the pressure to make an impact is starting to develop, we shouldn't ignore the fact that Saturn is about to move into Aries. I mean, Saturn moves into Aries. Well, if you're in California, Saturn will move into Aries this afternoon. If you're in Alaska or Hawaii, if you're in Australia, it won't move into Aries until tomorrow. But that is important, Saturn moving into Aries, and I will be talking about Saturn moving into Aries, a great deal. Particularly given the fact that Saturn stays in Aries for a long time, for a period of years, and so this movement of Saturn in Aries, does matter. I think that you're already starting to feel it. It's not because of the cusps. As you know, I do not accept this concept of cusp. I don't think that a planet starts to pick up the qualities of the following sign, or I don't think there's any point where, for example, Pisces and Aries sort of merge into each other as Saturn moves from Pisces to Aries. I don't believe that. I think that a change of sign is a once and for all event which takes place instantaneously. One moment, one split moment. You're in one sign, the next moment you're in the next sign, and that's the way it is. But Saturn is still getting close to the Aries point. That is true. And the closer and closer it gets to the Aries point, the more you feel it. And the Aries point for you just might be about not just your ambitions, but the world at large and how you relate to the world. And you are aware of it all. You can see what's happening on this planet, and some of it isn't good. You recognize you do recognize it, but to an extent, you can personalize the collective, personalize what seems to be impersonal. And that might be something that you need to be working on, not just now, but over the next few months. Perhaps you're starting to make the slow preparation for, I don't know, the Sun moving into Aries, and that's not so far away now. Actually, Sun moves into Aries next month, isn't it? I don't know, 21st of March, and I think that's going to be a very important time for you when you're really going to have to change gear. You can no longer theorize, and you'll now have to take action. And right now, though, it perhaps is a time to theorize and to look at what is available. And this goes back to what I was saying, right at the beginning of this piece on your sign. Do look at what is available, and through perhaps other people, through just looking at what's going on in the world around you, you can get insights into the future, and you can just listen to these insights. You can take them on board, but I don't think you have to decide anything. Not yet. Leo. The sun is still moving through Aquarius, and it's still conjunct the Venus-Mars midpoint. I mean, I have to say that. I mean, just a reminder, because the sun and Venus and Mars are moving, roughly at the same speed. This aspect, the sun on the Venus-Mars midpoint, it's just with us all the time. It's just will not go away, and so Leo, do make the most of it. Venus and Mars, as I've said to you on numerous occasions, is about attractiveness and how you can sort of maximize your attractiveness. I think that's what you're going to want to do, and perhaps appearances and style do matter to a point. And so do think about how you are getting attention. I mean, continue to think about how you are getting attention, particularly while the sun is still in Aquarius. It's still in your opposite sign. You can't ignore other people. You can't ignore the impact you're having on them, and small things, what you wear, what you say, can make a difference. Of course, the sun is not going to stay in Aquarius forever, and next week the sun will move into Pisces. So that's something you shouldn't forget. And at the same time, we've got the moon moving through Capricorn, and the moon in Capricorn is making sextiles to Venus and Mercury. And I think that those sextiles for you should be pretty helpful. They do allow you to get things together, and you're able to create an environment that you feel, relatively comfortable with. And harmony does matter. Moon sextile Venus, just feeling that everything is aesthetically pleasing. I think that's going to be quite important for you, and do think perhaps about the zen of your environment. Zen. It's just taking things. Don't ask me about Zen. I mean, I'm not saying I know a great deal about it, but just making sure that everything is in order, everything is balanced, and that it's not cluttered. And I think that the idea of it not being cluttered, well, I actually think that is very important. You need space. You need space to think, and you also need space to be healthy. I mean, if you have an uncluttered environment, it's easier to just get a sense of your own body, and what is good for your body, and it also says something about how you are talking, what you're telling people, and it's just very important at the moment, Leo, to just keep it as simple as possible, and not to feel that you need to have a huge amount of attention. I mean, the moon has just has gone out of Sagittarius. There's nothing in fire. Well, that is going to change. I mean, Neptune is in a fire sign. We're about to have Saturn moving into a fire sign. Now, Saturn is a non-discovered planet. Saturn is a traditional planet. So, if, for example, if I am looking at a chart and I'm asking myself, does someone have fire in their chart? How do I make that decision? Under what circumstances would I say that someone has no fire in their chart? Someone has no fire in their chart if they don't have a traditional planet in a fire sign, and the traditional planets include Jupiter and Saturn. So from now on, for the next couple of years, there won't be a time when there are no traditional planets in fire signs. And as a Leo, that should be a relief. The inspiration you need, that buzz is just always going to be there at some level, even if that buzz is created by Saturn in Aries. And Saturn in Aries is something that I think you need to be aware of. With Saturn in Aries, that can say something about your beliefs, what you believe in, and what kind of beliefs. Now, you might say that Saturn in Aries, from your perspective, you might be connected with one God. Now, I'm absolutely not telling you what to believe in. But there is this concept, of a single God. I mean, that's what Saturn is about. Okay, one can equate Saturn perhaps with a sky god, or a god that might be quite dramatic, but it is a single god, and there is often a connection between Saturn and the Judeo-Christian religions. That's certainly a way of looking at it. And I'm not saying that you should be following a Judeo-Christian religion, but it may say something about your relationship to God with Saturn moving into Aries. I mean, don't take me too seriously. I mean, in the sense that this is just a 12-sign forecast, and I'm just trying to look at the symbolism. But it might also be about where authority comes from. I mean, authority can come from God, and so your conception of the supernatural, might change, with Saturn moving into Aries. I mean, I'll be talking more about it. I mean, I'll probably talk more about Saturn in Aries, when I look at what's going on in your life, over the weekend. But it is an important change, and if you're in the Americas, late this afternoon, Saturn does move into, or at least this evening, Saturn really will be moving into Aries, and that is going to create a change. And so with Saturn in Aries, it might also say something about other people and how they develop. The important people in your life with Saturn moving into Aries, you could notice a change. They might start to be maybe taking themselves more seriously, being more authoritative, and perhaps being more demanding. So that is a possible manifestation of Saturn moving out of Pisces and into Aries. Virgo. I think that today should be okay. I don't see any reason to think that it might be a bad day. I mean, you've got Moon in an Earth sign, Moon in Capricorn. I mean, that's great. And the Moon is making a sextile to Venus, and it is making a sextile to Mercury. And I think that with those two aspects, I think you're going to feel a relatively high level, of support. I mean, getting support, is always important. It's always nice to know that you're not alone, and so you can do what is important to you, but at the same time you can be appreciated for that. And sometimes Virgos do feel unappreciated, but not at the moment. And I think that you come over as being someone who is interesting, and it's therefore not a time to be hiding anything. But at the same time, you're not trying to be controversial. I mean, at least most Virgos are not trying to be controversial. With Moon sextile Mercury, and Mercury conjunct the South Node, I think most Virgos are just trying to smooth things over. They're trying to make things simple, straightforward. You don't want to hurt anyone's feelings. And if you are being sufficiently supported, in particular, if your creativity is being supported, then you're not going to complain. You're not going to cause any trouble. I mean, what more can you want if you're getting outside support? Now, having said all that, from a heliocentric view, Mercury is making a square to Mars. So we've got, well, let's just look at the heliocentric chart just to remind ourselves. So here is the heliocentric chart. So there is Mercury at 12 degrees Taurus. There is Mars at 10, 11 degrees Aquarius. So that Mercury-Mars square could cut in, but it depends. Because, when we're talking about a heliocentric chart, we're often talking about something that is really quite impersonal. It's not about mundane reality. It's quite high level, it's quite cosmic, and it may be that you don't pick up on that Mercury-Mars. If you do pick up on that Mercury-Mars, it could be that you just become concerned about something of wider significance. So, I don't think it's about, you getting angry because someone has, filled the dishwasher the wrong way. Filling dishwashers. That's kind of interesting that you hear this. You hear this mention. I was listening to something on the news about someone getting a divorce because the husband couldn't fill the dishwasher right. It can happen, apparently, but we're not talking about these kind of things. We're talking about wider issues that you might get concerned about, wider global issues that really might just get to you, and you feel that they are important, and you feel they need to be discussed, they need to be talked about, and so there could be an anger about broader issues. But as far as everyday life, dealing with people on a day-to-day, minute-by-minute level, I think that there is a broad sense of harmony. And as I said, at the beginning of this piece, I do think that your abilities and your creativity, are going to be appreciated, and I think that you're going to have the opportunity to show everyone what you can do. And I think that by and large, you are going to be appreciated. Libra. Right now, Libra, you probably feel that you don't necessarily, want to do much. Why? You look at the world and it might seem, ever so slightly dangerous. I mean, let's not forget that Saturn is very close to the Aries point. It's at noon in New York time. Saturn is at 29 degrees 55 Pisces. This evening, if you're in the Americas, or even this afternoon, Saturn actually makes the sign change. And from a Libran perspective, of course that's important, because Aries is your opposite sign, and Aries being your opposite sign, is not just about other people. It's just about the world in which you live. What's happening. And I think the world might seem dangerous, and you might not fully understand what's going on, and it might just feel that it's just best to do nothing and just to watch from a safe distance. Maybe you don't even want to watch, you just want to just be in your own world. Nothing wrong with being in your own world, by the way. And we've got the moon today. We've got the moon still in Capricorn, and the moon in Capricorn is it's making sextiles to Mercury and Venus. In other words, the moon is making a sextile to your ruling planet, and so perhaps you should work on those sextiles. What those two sextiles might mean, and those two sextiles are really about focusing on yourself, I would have said. Looking after yourself, putting your own interests first, making sure that you feel comfortable. And it might be, today being Friday, maybe you want to start the weekend. It's in fact in America, I think it's in a public sense. I think it's a long weekend. I believe that Monday is President's Day. Well, when I say America, I mean if you're in the United States, Monday is President's Day. So for certainly for government employees, I think it's a long weekend, and so for many in the US, a Friday might be the beginning of a long weekend. And so if it is the beginning of a long weekend, well, even if you're not in the United States, Friday might be the time where you just want to just relax and start looking after yourself. And with that moon sextile Venus, moon sextile Mercury, it perhaps there's something about your health and what you can do to just make yourself feel better, make yourself feel good about yourself, making sure that your body is, your mind and your body are just in accord with this crazy world. In accord, maybe you feel you need to protect yourself from a crazy world, and that goes back to this Saturn moving into Aries. And it's just because you just had Neptune moving into Aries, you've got this Saturn Neptune conjunction coming up in Aries, and you can see how things could get complicated, and you could see perhaps how certain relationships could become a real problem. Certain people could be really sort of weighing in on you if you give them too much time, too much space. Well, you might not be able to get rid of them. That's a possibility, but I wouldn't worry about it too much. And as far as today is concerned, I think it's just important that you probably look after yourself and you don't feel that there's anything you absolutely have to do. But don't forget your mind. I think, Libra, your mind is actually on pretty good form right now, and you can be quite inspired and you can have some great ideas. And maybe that is another reason why it's a good idea not to be out in the world. If you're out in the world, these ideas might be forgotten. But if you're somewhere where you feel good, where you feel safe, your mind is allowed to work undisturbed, you can come up with great ideas which can be put into action. And, the moon is in Capricorn. It's obviously in an earth sign. Making a sextile to Venus, making a sextile to Mercury. So great ideas, including great ideas about your work, your career, your direction, they happen when you are away from society, or at least when you have some distance, and perhaps you can write these ideas down, and you can think about how you can make them real in the not so distant future. Scorpio. Mars is making a quincunx to Jupiter. I mean, that is the main aspect today, at least the main aspect involving your ruler. And so, we need to think about, what that might actually mean. So, Mars is in Aquarius, and, with Mars in Aquarius, you're probably quite stubborn. You like to do things your way, at your own pace. You certainly you don't want any disturbance. You don't want any distraction. You absolutely have an idea about how things should be developing. So your first inclination might be just to hold firm and not to worry too much about what's going on, out there. But that quincunx to Jupiter represents something else that you don't really want to consider, because it maybe makes things too complicated, or gives you too much work to do, or it just gives you too much to think about. And that Jupiter is perhaps about a new way of looking at things. There's something quite elevated about that Jupiter, and maybe you're halfway there, but you're not fully there, and you need to just look at the complexity of things, and also just look at how wonderful things could also be. I mean, that is part of the challenge of Jupiter being in Cancer. Jupiter stays in Cancer until the summer, when it stays in a year, a year in each sign. And the challenge for you of Jupiter in Cancer, not just now, but over the next few months, is really going to be to elevate your life, and perhaps to find some system or some spirituality or some philosophy that can guide your life. I mean, it's already there. I mean, every Scorpio has their own philosophy, but maybe that philosophy needs to be enhanced, in certain cases changed. I mean, transformation is an important issue for every Scorpio. I mean, if you follow the symbolism of the scorpion, of the Scorpio, certainly the snake. If you take the snake as a symbol of Scorpio, it's shedding. You have to shed your skin every now and then, and so the concept of change and going further just might be something you resist. That's something you don't want to bother with. You don't want to have to bother with. But I think you need to bother with. This is kind of like, Jupiter knocking on your door, saying it needs attention. You need to take things to a new level. We do not want stagnation. And that is really what we're trying to avoid here. And that's perhaps what it's telling you. There's a danger here with Mars quincunx Jupiter, that you could stagnate. Intellectually stagnate, and philosophically and even spiritually stagnate. I mean, that is a slight danger. I don't want to overdo it, but it's just some possibility. But that quincunx is giving you a way out, but it's not. But it's maybe a way out that you might be resistant to. But what can you do? Well, what you can do is you can be intellectually active, and you can think, you can process. These are all things that you can do. The moon is making a sextile to Mercury, making a sextile to the North Node. You can be intellectually active in terms of things that you find interesting, things that you find to be stimulating. And so if you want to do something that's interesting, in your own way, then go ahead and do it, and try to explore. It's not such a bad idea. So the overall message, Scorpio, is that you just need to sort of expand your horizons a bit, and you don't have to do anything dramatic, but you just familiarizing yourself with new things, new information which may contradict some of your existing beliefs. I don't think that would do any harm. In fact, I think it would be the right thing to do. Sagittarius. Well, Sagittarius, Saturn is getting ready to move into Aries. In fact, if you're in the Americas, then this afternoon or this evening, Saturn will move into Aries. And the advantage of Saturn moving into Aries, I mean, there are disadvantages of Saturn moving into Aries, but one advantage of Saturn moving into Aries is that Saturn is moving into a fire sign, and it's not going to leave. I mean, it's just that's where it's going to stay. So if you've been, listening to my horoscopes, every now and then, I say, oh, well, there's no fire in the sky today. I say that. Maybe I say it too often. Maybe I say it just because I'm trying to grasp for the words. It's easy to say. I mean, sometimes I just state the obvious because I've got to keep the flow going, don't I? To be honest, but I won't be able to say that anymore. Not for a few years. Because Saturn is a traditional planet. It's one of the 7 traditional planets. When I do my elemental counts, when I say, you've got no fire in your chart, you've got air in your chart, whatever, I use the 7 planets. I'm not interested in Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto when doing the elemental counts. I will not be able to say there is no fire in the sky anymore, because Saturn is traditional. It's now is a traditional planet. It's moving into Aries. It's going to stay in Aries, and so you should be pleased about that. It means that the fires will always be burning. They're not going to go out, and that means you are going to be sustained. Now, that doesn't mean to say that it's always going to be easy. I mean, I'm going to talk about Saturn in Aries, quite a lot over the next few days. But Saturn in Aries, that kind of forces you to think about who you are and what you can do, and what you can do well. And it's not always easy, is it? You might have your doubts. You might feel you can't do it, and that can be the issue of Saturn in Aries. But it's a challenge which is going to last for a couple of years. Just finding out what you're good at, what you feel comfortable with, and you can't be good at everything. That's certainly true, and you may realize that there are certain things which just aren't working for you, in which case you should just accept that. But there are other things which you can do really well, brilliantly well. And I think that with Saturn in Aries, perhaps the message is going to be that if you want to excel at something, maybe you're going to have to sort of work hard at it. It's not going to just be straightforward. You're going to have to push yourself, and this might be something that you are starting to feel maybe late today, maybe more likely into tomorrow. But it's just the beginning, and I don't really want to say that you're going to immediately feel Saturn in Aries, because Saturn in Aries, well, it's a long-term process. Saturn will move through Aries, over quite a prolonged period of time. So there is an underlying seriousness to today, and into the weekend. You understand that some things are important. I mean, the moon is in Capricorn. And the moon in Capricorn is making sextiles to Venus and Mercury. Those sextiles, they're not exciting, but I do think that they could be very useful. They could even be profitable. There is a material feel to those sextiles. I mean, the moon is in Capricorn; it's in an Earth sign, and it might be that you can do something quite clever. Not dramatically clever, which facilitates you in a financial sense, that you can perhaps get something together financially with those sextiles. Something does click, and maybe if you feel that something belongs to you, maybe Sagittarius, there really is a way of there is a way of getting hold of it, and all you have to do is just to be firm but polite. You don't have to have any big arguments about it, and I think that your social skills may actually help you in a material sense. And as far as other things are concerned, some things could be irritating. I mean, there is a quincunx between Mars and Jupiter, and with Mars quincunx Jupiter, it might be something you realize, something you discover kind of irritates you, sort of upsets you. You're trying to do some research, you're trying to learn something, and you learn something new, and you learn something new, and it seems to be sort of upsetting. But it's important not to take facts in isolation. There is some danger of that. You take a fact and you put a lot of energy into getting a hold of the fact, and maybe several facts, and those facts in themselves seem worrying, and it's important not to see them in isolation. One can panic if one finds something. Perhaps it's of a sort of bureaucratic nature. Of course, in the United States, it's the beginning of tax season. So if you're in the United States and you're concerned about your tax return, I think the first deadline is on sort of April the 15th. April the 15th, you have to file your tax. You can ask for an extension, but you do have to pay the IRS what you owe by the April the 15th, even if you do get an extension. But for example, it may be that there's just something factual that relating to finance, which may be relating to finance. It needn't, but it's sort of, there's something that has to be dealt with, or perhaps it's a piece of paper you need to get hold of. But if there are any complications, there might be complications, but I think Sagittarius, you should be able to deal with it. I think you're going to be able to deal with it very well. And maybe going back to this Mars quincunx Jupiter, the challenge here is to take something that you don't necessarily want to hear and just work with it and untangle it. And I think that's something that you can, will be able to do very well if you put in the effort. Capricorn. Saturn is getting ready to change signs. It's moving out of Pisces and it's moving into Aries. And so as far as this sign change is concerned, it takes place, I believe, on Saturday at 0 degrees 11 Greenwich Mean Time, 11 minutes past midnight in London. So that means, so that's on Saturday, yes. That means that if you're in the United States or in the Americas, Saturn moves into Aries today. I think if you're in Iceland, it will move into Aries today. So I don't know what, I forget what time zone Iceland is on, but if you're in the Americas, if you're in Iceland, it's today that the sign change happens. And if you're in California, it will be this afternoon. If you're in New York, it will be, I think, early evening. So that is a big change. It's always a big change when your ruler shifts. And as far as what this shift is concerned about, well, it might be a good idea. It depends how old you are. But it's a good idea to think about, the last time it happened. So the last time, well, okay, I know that Saturn has actually moved into Aries last year, but I'm talking about the last big shift, 29 and a half years ago, or something like that. That would have been, I think, what would that be, the mid to late 90s. So you might want to sort of go back and think about what was going on in the mid to late 90s if you were still alive or still conscious there. So there might be an echo here between what's happening now and what was happening, nearly 30 years ago. But things change over 30 years, and with Saturn moving into Aries, do think about where you are living. I mean, that's the obvious thing. I mean, Saturn in Aries, very much can be about the home and your relationship to the home. And you might have been living somewhere for a long time, and you look again, and you're thinking, well, is this right? Is something wrong? Now, you might feel that it's time to move, but something needs to change. Now, it could be that things need to change in terms of decoration, furniture, or it could be about your family. There is something very family orientated for you about Saturn moving into Aries, and thinking about your responsibilities towards members of your family. But in certain cases, it might be thinking about how members of your family could be a real burden. Maybe they're too much of a burden. Perhaps your extended family might be trying to make you feel guilty, or they could make you feel guilty when Saturn is in Aries. And then there's a question of what do you do? What do you actually do about it? And Saturn in Aries. I'm not saying it's the best place for Saturn to be, but it's a powerful place for Saturn, and I think that it's really about just thinking about the foundation of things. And for many people, the foundation is the home and the family, but it might also represent the past, the distant past, how you are influenced by the past, how you are even influenced by generation after generation. We are, all of us, or many of us, are influenced by things which happened before we were born. And so it might be a good idea with Saturn moving into Aries to think about that, particularly as a Capricorn. I mean, I think Capricorns are quite good at relating to this past and sort of perhaps bringing things out into the open. I know that's all a bit heavy. I mean, it's not the only thing going on. I mean, today the moon is continuing to move through Capricorn. It's moving through your sign. It's making a sextile to Mercury, sextile to sextile to Venus, sextile to Mercury. So I think Capricorn, it's a day when you're going to be able to give a very good account of yourself. I think that you're going to find it easy to communicate. People will listen to what you have to say. And if you want to make an effort to get your message across, you can. It might be that you make a short trip. Might be a few yards, might be a few miles. Maybe you can walk it. Maybe you don't have to go by car or bus or whatever. You make a short trip. You deliver your message, and people just get it. And at the same time, I think that you have a fundamental power to you. I mean, not a heavy power necessarily, but it's just that people will tend to trust you, and they will think that you have got something, and they can maybe rely on you. They can certainly rely on your good judgment. Aquarius. So Saturn rules Aquarius, and that means we do have to think about what Saturn is doing. And Saturn is right at the end of Pisces. In fact, if you're in America, then this afternoon or this evening, or even in Iceland, this afternoon and this evening, Saturn changes sign. Saturn moves out of Pisces and it moves into Aries. And I think that's not necessarily such a bad thing. I mean, I know people say that Saturn is, Saturn is fallen in Aries because it's exalted in Libra, but maybe you've just got a bit bored of Saturn in Pisces. I mean, Saturn in Pisces might have been a time when you might have been kind of tied up with certain issues that you didn't find particularly interesting. Maybe there were money issues that needed to be worked through, and hopefully you've made some good progress there. And now that Saturn moving into Aries, I think that you will enjoy the change. You'll also be aware that there is work to be done, but still it doesn't matter. And I think perhaps your first feeling as Saturn moves into Aries might be that you don't necessarily know enough. I mean, Aquarians know a lot, that's true, but maybe you could know more. And this might prompt you to gather facts or to familiarize yourself with something. Now, I'm not saying this is about taking a course or anything like that, or going to college or whatever. It's just about understanding something better. And it is going to be a great time the next couple of years, for reading, studying. Again, it doesn't have to be a formal course. Just just familiarizing yourself with things that you recognize that you don't know about, and you don't have to make a fuss about it. You might want to set yourself some knowledge goals. What are the areas that you feel sort of maybe ignorant about, and what can you do to fill the gap? And it could be also about intellectual fulfillment. I mean, we live in a society where people don't read so much, and there might be a book or a number of books that you feel that you need to read. We all have those times in our life. I mean, I was doing a lot of tutoring. I mean, I don't do tutoring now, but I was tutoring, quite a few years ago, when I came to America, and I found myself in a situation where I had to tutor Shakespeare. And the amazing thing, I mean, I'm ashamed to say this, that I hadn't read Hamlet. I mean, I know that's a terrible admission, and I realised that I had to go through Hamlet. So I had this experience of tutoring someone Hamlet, and I spent ages on Hamlet. I sort of read it several times. I watched a YouTube video on Hamlet, and I finally got it. And so there may be something like that. Something that you need to read. You familiarize yourself. Maybe you should have sorted out when you were a child, but you didn't. But it doesn't matter. Now's the time to fill those gaps. And so that's certainly something very constructive you could be doing, over the next couple of years. So maybe you could create a reading list. I mean, that I think would be a good way of doing it. I mean, we don't read enough, so I think that is one approach. And you don't have to make a big thing about it. You don't have to tell people what you're doing. Then you can suddenly announce in a year or two's time, but you've actually got to read the complete works of Shakespeare, even if you haven't read any of Shakespeare's plays or whatever. So I mean, that's one manifestation. Another thing that you have to watch out for with Saturn in Aries, and I hate to be negative, but do think about car issues. Transport could be frustrating, and so ask yourself, how do you move around from A to B? I mean, do you use bus? Do you walk? Maybe you don't have to move around from A to B, but do take your car seriously, and don't leave things to chance. So if you're buying cars over the next couple of years, particularly if they're used cars, I mean, who can afford to buy a new car? But I mean, everyone they use monthly payments. Don't know. Well, that was interesting. That I was getting involved in local politics, and you can look at the finances of people standing for in a local council, and you look at their finances, and you see that some people have in fact people who stand for local government here, they have pretty simple finances. I think people who have complicated finances don't stand for local government because they don't want to disclose too much. But that standard thing, paying that $500 a month for the car, that's just such a standard thing about local politicians. Maybe that says something about every American. I don't know. I don't know how anyone can afford a new car, but I suppose the reason is because people just pay. They just pay that $500 a month. And that's how they do it. But do think about these things. How are you traveling? What could go wrong if you're buying cars over the next couple of years? Be really careful about buying a car, and think about what could go wrong, and don't trust the person you're buying the car from, because we shouldn't forget that Saturn is in Aries. Saturn is fallen in Aries. I think there are some great things about Saturn moving into Aries, but with a fallen Saturn in Aries, you have to ask what could go wrong. And what could go wrong might relate to transport, and I'm thinking particularly of cars. Something, and it could be a source of real pain. So that's probably an issue that you really need to think about. There may be other transport issues when we're thinking about bus routes. Maybe bus routes will change if you're with driving, and suddenly they'll decide to do roadworks that last for a year. So these are all things that could happen with Saturn moving through Aries. Pisces. So Saturn is leaving your sign. It may leave your sign this afternoon or this evening if you're in the Americas. It may not be until tomorrow. But that is a change. You've had Saturn on and off in your sign for the last few years, and it's, I think, been quite good. I think it's allowed you to really think about who you are, and also I think to establish your authority. Saturn has really almost been your adopted ruling planet. I mean, of course, Saturn does not rule Pisces, but while it's been in Pisces, it's just had a strong relationship with you. So you could say that this teacher has done its work, and the teacher is now leaving, and Saturn is moving into Aries, and with Saturn moving out of Pisces into Aries, there may be a feeling of liberation that suddenly things are changing, that you've learnt your lesson, and you can really start to find yourself and be free. So that's something that is definitely happening. And of course, I'm talking about a sort of a longer term process. I'm not saying that the moment Saturn moves into Aries, you're going to feel the change. But it may be, I don't know, maybe a few weeks before you really start to realize that something has changed. On a shorter term level, the moon is still moving through Capricorn. And in Capricorn, it's making a sextile to Venus, and it's also making a sextile to Mercury. And of course, Venus and Mercury are in your sign. In fact, the moon is making a sextile to the North Node. So we've got Venus, North Node, Mercury in Pisces. Venus, remember, is exalted in Pisces. So you are someone who, you can be yourself. You can express yourself. You come over, I think, as a warm and sympathetic person, and I think that moon making those sextiles is going to intensify that. You should find that when you're with people, you can really not just be yourself, but you can express who you are, and I think that in general, other people are going to like you. And furthermore, Pisces, I think you can come over as being quite an interesting and inspired person. So you don't have to keep everything to yourself. So if you have insights or suggestions, then now might be a time to share them with everyone. I mean, people really might be interested. It might go further than that. You can be inspiring if you want to be inspiring. So that's pretty fortunate. And as far as relationships are concerned, things might happen that you weren't necessarily expecting, that might sort of catch you off guard. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they're bad. I think they're sort of neutral to good. But although, at first someone does something or someone appears and you weren't expecting it and you might not know how to respond. But, when you look at things again, you will see that, there is something going on here which could be very fortunate, or at the least give you some excitement. And those are my forecasts for the 12 signs. And now it's time to look at things from the viewpoint of the I Ching. So, I asked the question, what is Friday going to be like for those watching the I Ching section of this video? And the first hexagram I got was hexagram number 49, which is revolution. I think we had revolution quite recently. I mean, revolution is obviously about a change. Things have reached a certain stage and they can't go on forever, and we need to think about what we need to do. And so we need to really be looking at established structures and ask ourselves, maybe they need to be overthrown. Maybe, they're not doing anything useful anymore. And so we should not be satisfied with the way things are. And it may be down to us to create that change. Now, this revolution might take place in terms of our own lives. It might not involve anyone else. It might be about a personal revolution. We have been leading our life in a particular way, and now we think, hold on, that's enough of that. And this might be to do with Saturn. Saturn, remember, is about to change sign. So Saturn is a fairly generational planet. I mean, Saturn stays in a sign for a few years, and so when it changes sign, there can be a change. And Saturn, we see Saturn as being about stability, as not being revolutionary. But we should not forget, if we look at Greek mythology, it was Saturn that overthrew his father, Uranus, or Uranus. That was Saturn. So there is a revolutionary aspect to Saturn, which is sometimes forgotten. And so maybe with Saturn now on the Aries point, we're starting to see that some things do have to be changed, and we have a responsibility to create that change. Now, this hexagram has two moving lines. Second line moves, fourth line moves. So with the second line moving, maybe we're in a situation where we've tried to create change. We've done different things. We've made suggestions and we've done our best, but somehow things haven't moved. Maybe people are just not listening, and so we have to try something else. And that something else that we should be trying may actually be a full-scale revolution. We have the ability, and it's we just have to prepare ourselves. It's not like we don't want. It's not like anarchy. That's not what it's about. Having a revolution just for the sake of it. It's about having a plan, having an end result, and it could also be about power structures. So if someone else has been in control in power and they just haven't been doing a good job, they haven't been listening, well, it's time to make a change. And so we've tried, but sometimes revolution is the only option. And then the fourth line moves, and it's a kind of it's a similar picture. We need to be honest. We need to be open and honest about what is possible. We need to recognize the situation, and if we're honest, if we're absolutely honest with ourselves, then we know what needs to be done. And something has to be changed, and maybe something has to be overthrown, and it might not involve other people. It may just say something about our own lives. Maybe we're not happy with our own lives. We're perhaps not happy with certain aspects of our own lives, in which case now is that time for that personal revolution. So you've got two moving lines, and that means that we move to a second hexagram, and the hexagram it moves to is hexagram number 5. So this hexagram, waiting, it sounds as if it's quite a passive hexagram, but I don't think it is, because the question is, waiting for what? We can't wait forever, and at some stage we've got to make that move. And so revolution, waiting, wait, when are we actually going to do something? And in fact, action is kind of implied in this hexagram. We've got to work out when we're going to make the move. We have to take the risk. We have to wade into the water. That means getting our feet wet. We may have to swim across the water. I mean, again, not literally, but the time for action has arrived, or is very, very soon going to arrive. And so when you put these hexagrams together, revolution leading to waiting, we are aware something has to change. We know that we've tried everything else, but revolution is the way forward. We know that if we're honest and sincere, that we've got what it takes, and we need to get the moment right. We must not leave it too long, because if we leave it too long, then things are just going to get worse, and we're just going to start to really stagnate, and that's absolutely not what we want to do. So do get ready for that change. And if we're talking about change, the big change taking place today is Saturn moving into Aries. So for the rest of the video, this is what I want to talk about. So here is the moment that Saturn moves into Aries. Here is the chart set for London of that precise moment. And you can see that it takes place on February the 14th. That is a Saturday at 12:11 a.m. Of course, in terms of planetary days, I don't know whether you've played with planetary days, planetary hours. I've not talked about planetary days and planetary hours in any of my videos so far. Maybe I should. But the planetary day starts at dawn. So Saturn in Aries it might seem as if it's happening on Saturday, but from a planetary perspective, that's still Friday. Saturday doesn't start until dawn. So that's I didn't know why I mentioned that. It's just a point to say. So this happens at 12:11 a.m. on February the 14th, London time. In fact, that's Saturn in Aries set for Kiev. So hold on, that's not quite what I wanted to show you. That's what I wanted to show you. That's there it is. That's the chart, and you can see that Saturn is exactly there. So what does it mean? Saturn moving into Aries, is it a good thing or is it a bad thing? Well, we've already had a taste of Saturn in Aries. Saturn was in Aries last year, but then it went retrograde back into Pisces. And so when the Saturn moves into Aries, in theory, it's weakened. The reason it's weakened is because Saturn is fallen in Aries. And because, Saturn is exalted in Libra, therefore it's fallen in Aries. And that is not a great position for Aries to be. And if we look at Saturn in Aries, theoretically, you can see the frustration of Saturn in Aries. Aries as a planet is, Aries isn't a planet. Sorry, Aries is a sign. It's the first sign in the zodiac. First sign of the zodiac. It's that youthful, dynamic, initiative-based sign. And having Saturn in there, Saturn is this older, influence. Okay, it might be wiser, but it's into structure, and it's Aries is just the last place that Saturn wants to be in. Maybe the last place, one of the last places that Saturn wants to be in. It just doesn't work, and it could be, it's kind of frustrating for Saturn to be in Aries. Saturn doesn't feel comfortable in Aries. Saturn wants perhaps greater maturity in Aries. Aries is not comfortable having Saturn in its sign, and so there's just a general feeling of mismatch when you've got Saturn in Aries. At least that's how we might feel about it. And you might say the same for people who have who have Saturn in Aries in their horoscopes. But a lot of people have Saturn in Aries in their horoscopes, and they lead perfectly productive, happy lives. So if you've got Saturn in Aries in your chart, I mean, don't worry too much about it. Now, this particular Saturn in Aries, I mean, we have to think about how long it's going to stay in Aries. I mean, that is an important question. So Saturn is not going to retrograde back out of Aries and into Pisces. It's not going to happen anymore. We've had that. But so as far as when Saturn leaves Aries and moves into Taurus, the first time that Saturn moves into Taurus is where has it gone? It is on April the 14th. Yeah, it's on April the 13th at 3:30. That's April the 13th, 2028. So from now, let's get this right. From now until from now until April 2028. Saturn is solidly going to be in Aries. So that's over 2 years. So that means that we're going to have at least one planet in fire signs for the next couple of years. I'm not going to be saying when I do my horoscopes, I hope I'm going to carry on for the next couple of years. I plan on. I need to keep going until I drop, but I'm not going to be saying until before April 2028, there's no fire in the sky. There's always going to be fire in the sky, because my definition of fire in the sky, when you do an elemental balance, is to use the traditional planets. I don't, when I do the elemental count, I don't count Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto. So there's always going to be that energy. So that's not such a bad thing, even though it's Saturn. There is fire. There's always going to be a representative of fire. There's going to be that energy. The fires are never going to go out. I mean, they might be dim when you've only got Saturn in a fire sign, but you've still got Saturn there. So that does inject some energy into proceedings. Even though it might not necessarily feel like that. And so. That's definitely a good thing. We also have to think about what's special about this particular entry into Aries. And what is special is that Neptune is also in Aries. And I think in some respects it's difficult to disentangle Neptune in Aries and Saturn and Aries, at least while the two planets are close together. And when we look at Neptune and Saturn in Aries, we shouldn't just be thinking about Aries. We need to be thinking about the previous sign. We need to be thinking about Pisces. There has been, stuff in Pisces. Well, we've still got a lot of stuff in Pisces, but Saturn and Neptune are out of Pisces. And I've mentioned this on several occasions. So forgive me for if I'm repeating. Well, I am repeating myself. But with Neptune moving out of Pisces, we are moving into a time where people are looking for leadership. Absolutely, with Neptune moving into Pisces. If you're a weak leader, you are not. That is absolutely not what we don't. We just don't need that. And people are looking for that. They don't kind of know they're looking for that, but that's what they really want. the right kind of leader, and it's almost like better to have a terrible strong leader than a weak mediocre leader, almost. I mean, of course, that's not necessarily the case, but people want leadership, and if you've got leaders who are sort of indecisive, then they're not going to work. So you look at, for example, Keir Starmer in the UK, British Prime Minister. He is an incredibly weak Prime Minister. He's apparently even weaker now. He's now completely at the mercy of his backbenchers. I mean, in other words, members of Parliament, his other Labour members of Parliament. He's weak, he's indecisive, he changes his mind, he does lots of U-turns. Maybe this kind of would work to some extent when Saturn was in Pisces, but Saturn's not in Pisces anymore. And certainly Neptune is not in Pisces. So people want leadership with Neptune in Aries. I think, they'd rather have someone like Trump. I know a lot of you can't stand Trump, but Trump gives the impression of showing strong leadership. I think that's not necessarily the case. I think Trump is weaker than some people realize, that he is strongly influenced by advisors, and the last person he talked to. That's what they say about Trump, isn't it? It's always the last person that talked to him has the most influence. But anyway, people certainly want the impression of strong leadership, and that, to an extent, is what Trump is providing, and across the board, that's what people want. And this contrast with Neptune in Pisces, when things were sort of becoming chaotic, things were all over the place, and don't forget, with Neptune in Pisces, there was this kind of self-sacrificial feeling to Neptune in Pisces, that you had to apologize, that societies had to apologize, that you had to make up, and that you had to go out of your way to help people or give in to people if they have some imagined or real grievance. So Saturn in Pisces, countries apologizing for their history, talking about reparations for slavery, feeling that you have always got to think about individual differences and diversity, and the obsession with trans rights and so forth. I mean, the obsession with trans rights, did start to diminish when Trump got elected for the second time. But that's very Neptune in Pisces, and with Saturn in Pisces, there was still a Pisces feel to it. Saturn's still there. That's what we're supposed to be worrying about. Saturn in Pisces, worrying about our guilt. There's a lot of guilt connected to Pisces, but now Saturn's moving into Aries, Neptune's moving into Aries. That's perhaps in the past. There is an emphasis on Aries, so that's one thing going on with Saturn moving into Aries. And when you think about Saturn, you also think about the question of restriction. I mean, Saturn is the planet of restriction, and Jupiter is the planet of growth, and it's an optimistic planet, and Saturn is perhaps more pessimistic. So what does that mean when Saturn goes into Aries? Now, you could say that Saturn moving into Aries is about just increased negativity because Saturn is fallen in Aries. On the other hand, you might say Saturn moving into Aries, that it's weak because it's moving into its sign of its fall. On the other hand, we now have Jupiter in Cancer. Jupiter's going to go direct next month. Jupiter is exalted. So we're now increasingly in a position where Jupiter is getting stronger and Saturn is getting weaker. And it is possible that actually people are going to become more optimistic over the next few months. as soon as Jupiter goes direct. I know there's a huge amount of pessimism about everything, particularly the economy, but maybe it's not quite as bad as it seems. And as I've already pointed out, Jupiter and Saturn are eventually going to move towards a trine. Eventually going to make a trine. Jupiter will move into Leo over the summer, and Saturn will be in Aries. So Jupiter Saturn will be in trine aspect. And very often in terms of a business cycle, that can be quite positive. And I know that a lot of people are predicting, that the economy is going to crash and burn, right now. And there's an incredible amount of worry, but I'm not convinced. I mean, I'm not giving any financial advice. I'm not making any financial predictions, but I'm not convinced. There is an argument for saying that there is going to be a sudden sort of boost in positivity, maybe about the economy and so forth. I'm particularly thinking about the United States, that things may not be quite as bleak as they look, because, a weak Saturn might suggest that the whole forces of pessimism might be weaker. Now, when Saturn moves into Aries, it is in a sign ruled by Mars, and Mars is in Aquarius. So Mars is in a Saturn-ruled sign. So that means that straight away Mars and Saturn will be in mutual reception. So this kind of mitigates Saturn's weakness. I did say that Saturn's going to get weaker when it moves into Aries, but it may be that this weakness is not immediate. While Mars is in Aquarius, Saturn and Mars will be in mutual reception. And so perhaps we should be asking ourselves, when does Mars leave Aquarius? Because when Mars leaves Aquarius, Saturn really will become weak. And so that takes place, Mars leaving Aquarius is... Mars leaves Aquarius on the 3rd of March. So, yeah, 2nd of March. On the 2nd of March, Mars moves into Pisces. And then then Jupiter goes direct on the 11th of March. So in early March, the Jupiter-Saturn relationship really does change. Saturn becomes really weak. Jupiter starts to gain its strength. So you could argue that in early March, we're going to start to see some real positivity. So if there's a lot of negativity around, remember we also have Saturn starting to make a conjunction to Neptune, and so short term, maybe there are things to be positive about. I mean, thinking particularly about the business cycle and the economy and maybe the markets. I don't know. Again, I'm not making any financial predictions, but I'm just, making an argument. I'm saying there is an argument to be positive, based on astrology. It's not going to last forever. I mean, remember we have a Jupiter-Saturn opposition coming up in 2029. But I'm just thinking that there might be a respite, and of course that fits in with what's going on with Trump. I mean, there are midterms going on. That's number one. Number two, traditionally, Saturn rules the Democrats and Jupiter rules the Republicans. So there was that book, what was it called? Horary Astrology and the Judgment of Events. And in this, that's where, who wrote it? Who wrote Horary Astrology and the Judgment of Events? You can look it up. I should know, but the name is it Ivy Jacobson? I don't know. I think so. I'm not sure. But anyway, that book says, talks about those party rulerships. Those party rulerships. So I know things are looking bad for the Republicans, supposedly, but it may be that as you go into early March, Jupiter is getting stronger, and Saturn is really getting weaker. And this may say something about the midterms. So things may not be quite as bad for the Republicans as things seem on the surface. And yeah, we do have the midterms. And of course, if you've got the midterms, Trump will be doing everything he can to pump the economy. I mean, he's got a new Fed chair. So this might, or a new Fed chair coming up. I know that this new Fed chair is supposed to be quite hawkish on interest rates, and he doesn't want to have too much I don't know, quantitative easing and fiscal expansion or whatever. I mean, economics is never my strong point, but to an extent, I think the things might not be so bad as they seem to be on the surface. Now, when we're talking about Saturn moving into Aries, it's always good to think about the structure of Saturn moving into Aries. What is Saturn actually doing from a sort of a midpoint perspective? When it makes that sign change. So we can look at the 90-degree dial. So if we look at the 90-degree dial for Saturn moving into Aries, what we're doing is we're essentially looking at the Saturn on the Aries point. So if we look at some of the midpoints that Saturn is on, Saturn is it's on the Sun Pluto midpoint. It's on the Neptune Aries midpoint. It's on the Uranus Pluto midpoint. So we talk about Saturn and revolution. When I was mentioning this when I was doing I Ching, Saturn and revolution. There is, I think, a link between Saturn and revolution, because, as I said, in Greek mythology, it was Saturn that overthrew his father, Uranus. And so with Saturn on the Uranus-Pluto midpoint and on the Sun-Pluto midpoint, don't forget the Sun is starting to move towards a square with Uranus. This Saturn on the Aries point, because it is on the Aries point, could overthrow things, and it might be really very destabilizing. The structure of some societies, maybe being shaken to its core. You look, for example, at the UK. The UK has just had Saturn on its moon, and people are now questioning the whole monarchy now. The whole structure of a monarchy, because of Charles's behaviour. Not Charles's behaviour, but the fact that Charles and the Queen, they gave Andrew, $12 million, or was it $12 million to pay off Virginia Guthrie, and so they knew what was going on, and so people are now saying that it really is time for King Charles to abdicate to save the monarchy, that Prince William should take over. That's an example of the whole structure of things being shaken, and I think there are many sort of European countries we know that where the structure is being shaken, it's enough, and this may be the case in the United States, where governments should be, I think, very afraid at this time when Saturn was moving into Aries, particularly at this precise moment, and maybe over the next few years, and because maybe when we look at the structure of Saturn as it hits Aries, as it hits the Aries point, maybe that does say something about the next couple of years. And because Saturn is on the Sun-Pluto midpoint, it's on the Aries point. You've got Aries on the Sun-Pluto midpoint, Aries on the Uranus-Pluto midpoint. Yeah, it's about people having enough and wanting to overthrow something. So I think that is very much a theme of Saturn changing sign, and it is dramatic, and I think it's made more dramatic, by the fact that Neptune is also moving into Aries. I don't know about astrocartography. I mean, is it worth it? Just taking the exact moment that Saturn changed sign and doing a map for it and seeing if that works. I mean, I'll give you an example. So in 1967, Saturn went into Aries. So Saturn went into Aries in March. So here's 1967 on. This is London time. Here's Saturn going into Aries on sort of March the 3rd, 1967, and the late 60s. By the way, I mean 1967 wasn't 1967 the summer of love? Saturn in Aries. Maybe we're seeing a different side to Saturn here. The whole sort of rebelliousness of the 60s, the importance of freedom. You don't normally associate that with Saturn in Aries, but clearly here this was going on. And you think about what happened, student protests, Vietnam, people are having enough. There was, in London there were big protests, Grosvenor Square, marching to the, I don't know quite when those protests were. I think that was after March the 3rd, 1967. And you had Paris in 1968, when you had the students and trade unionists marching on the streets of Paris, and you had the Prague Spring in 1968. So the Prague Spring was, of course, when you had the government of Dubček tried to distance itself from the rigidity of the communist system. I mean, Dubček was a communist, but he wanted a new type of communism, and where people had more freedom. And it was, the Prague Spring was a time of sort of cultural flowering, literature, and so forth. And then it got smashed when the Warsaw Pact tanks smashed into Czechoslovakia, then Czechoslovakia, in the late summer of 1968. So we could relocate this moment when Saturn moved into Aries to Prague. So here is Saturn moving into Aries, relocated to Prague, and you can see that Mars is exactly rising, and the South Node is exactly rising. You had, well, not exactly, the South Node is not exactly rising, but that Mars rising is, I'm afraid, saying more about the invasion than the spring itself. It's not necessarily talking about a cultural flowering, Mars rising, Mars in Scorpio rising. Okay, you could say that Mars in Scorpio was about sort of independence, asserting one's independence, but that was not really what it was about. But it's more about aggression. And Mars conjunct South Node, set for Prague, but particularly Mars on the ascendant is talking about the invasion. And look at Saturn. Saturn is at 0 degrees Aries, making an 135-degree aspect to the midheaven. So in that case, I think that the tragic, unfortunate side of the Prague Spring is shown by Saturn moving into Aries, and so that was an event that sort of took place sort of a year later. Over 18 months later. As far as this particular iteration of Saturn moving into Aries is concerned, we can do an astrocartography for it. So if we do an astrocartography for it and just see where on Earth that Saturn on Aries might manifest. So this is a chart. This is a map, and this double red line is perhaps something we should be thinking about. So these are going to be, all of the places where Saturn is on the IC at that precise moment when Saturn goes into Aries, and it's one. If we go through that red line, it goes through a swathe of Africa, it goes through Sudan. I mean, there's all sorts of horrible things happening in Sudan, still. And so Sudan might be in the news. It goes through Gaza, goes through Sinai, goes through Cyprus, and goes through eastern Ukraine. Does not go through Kiev. It goes to the east of Kiev, and so this might indicate with Saturn on the IC that this is where the conflict is, and over the next year, we will perhaps start to see Russia, take over that part of Ukraine, take the Donbass, take the territories it claims, and so that's the Saturn Neptune, hitting East Ukraine. It doesn't hit Moscow, and then Gaza. Are things done with Gaza? Are things really done with Gaza? With Saturn conjunct Neptune on the IC set for Gaza? Well, probably not. And while we're at it, we should probably be thinking about the United States chart, and what does it mean for Saturn to go into Aries for the United States? Well, with the United States, just a reminder of the United States chart. The United States, if we take 5:10 p.m. As the timing of the Declaration of Independence, then we need to look at the IC. The IC is at 0 degrees 53 Aries. So Saturn is about to move onto the United States' IC. There's a Saturn-Neptune conjunction on the United States' IC, and Saturn will then move to a square of Venus and a square to Jupiter. So while I think there is an argument to say that economically, or at least in terms of sentiment, things may be quite good for the United States over the next year, perhaps. Certainly, certainly over the spring and the summer. Still, we can't avoid the fact that Saturn and Neptune are going to be hitting a very sensitive point in America's chart, and the IC is, of course, the very foundations of what America is all about. And some of us might feel that the foundations of America are already under attack. Of course, it depends on your political view, but there's certainly more to be said about the United States and Saturn, and that's a subject I will be coming back to sooner rather than later. So that's it with Saturn in Aries. Thank you very much for watching this video. If you enjoyed this video, I would be very grateful if you were to like it. If you're not subscribed, super grateful if you were to subscribe. If you want to buy me a coffee, there's a link in the description. And I will talk to you again tomorrow.